a question that comes up a lot in the YouTube comment section is around overcrowding. And it's something which I haven't seen that much of in Bedford Borough because I guess generally overcrowding is not a big issue. But I know that in London, it's not unusual to see very large households in very small accommodation. And certainly the one case I can think of, I worked in a Bedford was where I think the mother was ineligible for assistance, so she was treated as being invisible. So, she although the family would have been overcrowded had they all been eligible, they were deemed not to be. But I just thought it a really good opportunity just to ask more about what is the definition of overcrowding. I've never worked a case that goes into detail with it, so I don't really understand it. And
Right.
effectively, when does someone become homeless? Where's the tipping point where actually they can make a homeless application because they are overcrowded?
Yeah. If I go backwards on that one and answer the second bit first, which is, can you make a homeless application because you're overcrowded? And the answer would be yes. You could if you could show that you were homeless because you were overcrowded. But just being, I'm afraid I've worded that badly, just being overcrowded won't mean that you're homeless for the purposes of being rehoused. Even if you're statutorily overcrowded, it's not a magic sort of label that then means, well, they've got to house you because you're statutorily overcrowded. The
So when you say statutory overcrowded, is there a specific definition in that kind of
Yeah,
that then means?
that brings me to sort of the first part of your question, which is the definition of statutory overcrowding is set out in the Housing Act 1985, sections 324 to 327, I think.
Okay.
And there's an appendix bit to the Act, which is part 10 with a Roman X, and that sets out the rules for determining it. And you can determine fairly scientifically whether somebody is statutorily overcrowded. And there's three tests. One is whether you've got a situation where two people of the opposite sex who are over 10 have to share a room. That would be one bit of statutory overcrowding. Another one would be where there are not enough rooms in the property for everybody to be able to sleep in the property. And the third one would be where there's enough rooms, but they aren't big enough, so the floor space is too small.
Okay.
Now, I won't go into the details of how many people and how many square feet, but those are the three tests. So you could have a situation where you've got children. I mean, the most common situation is where somebody gets given us. I mean, I'm dealing with one at the moment. It's unfortunate. Somebody was given a studio flat with a baby, and it's just far too small. The baby, I mean, but technically they're not. Well, they're not even statutorily overcrowded. But say, for instance, if she had two more children, just to say, or she formed a relationship with somebody else who had children, so you had 5 people living in a studio flat, there wouldn't be very much argument about whether they were statutorily well, they'd definitely be statutorily overcrowded. The question then would be whether they were homeless. And remember, the test for homelessness is where you have accommodation, is whether the accommodation is reasonable for you to continue to occupy. And this is where problems arise. And I had a case where I went to Central London County Court because the family were statutorily overcrowded, and we were feeling pretty confident. But then the local authority, we lost that case because the local authority were able to argue that in determining whether it's reasonable for them to continue to occupy, the local authority are entitled to have regards to the housing conditions in the area generally. And so they can say, well, it's really unfortunate, but they are statutorily overcrowded. But the homelessness, or the Housing Act 1996, doesn't define homelessness as arising where somebody's statutorily overcrowded. So it's a question for the local authority to determine.
And I
And
remember, oh sorry, that made me think. Just then, I remember Sarah Steinhardt talking about a case where I think the issue was disrepair, but it was another situation where the council was at liberty to look at the wider conditions of the district, and the council was basically saying, well, lots of these properties in this district are in disrepair, therefore, we don't have to do anything. And I think they did an FOI request, and they basically, they got
yeah,
detailed sort of statistics on how many properties were in disrepair, and they could actually show that that wasn't the case. And I just wonder if a similar approach might be possible with this argument. If a council is going to say, well, look, everyone in our district's overcrowded, whether there's some way of actually doing research on that to then present an argument and say, well, actually, only 20% of properties are actually overcrowded. It's the fact, and I just wonder if that's maybe a counter argument to a council taking that stance.
Yeah, well, actually, Sarah Steinhardt was the barrister on that case, what I'm
Okay.
talking about. And I think we did raise some disrepair issues, and we may even be talking about the same case.
Okay.
But we lost on that, and essentially, they relied on a case called Haruki versus Kensington and Chelsea from 2007, which says really it's for the local authority to decide this, and judges don't really want to get involved with making that determination. So, I think the lesson we learned from that is that obviously overcrowding is going to be a starting point for establishing that you're homeless. What you then have to do is show that because of the overcrowding, or because of reasons including the overcrowding, you are homeless, not intentionally homeless.
Yeah.
A good example would be if you've got a child you could even be homeless because the property's too small and you're not statutorily overcrowded. You could have a child with special needs who needs a room to calm down in because they get agitated or hyperactive. And if you then said, well, we've got a one-bedroom place and technically that we can sleep in the living room and all that sort of stuff, you couldn't. And another one would be where the children were clearly suffering at school. Maybe the brother or sister of a child with special needs, they can't go anywhere to do their homework because the little one's running around. And so you could argue that, and you could well win on that. Put it another way, there was a case where the council tried. You remember we were talking about breaking the chain of intentional homelessness. Well, there was a case where a family were found to be intentionally homeless, so they went away and got accommodation themselves in the private sector. But the council said, "Oh, that doesn't count because you were overcrowded, so you were homeless, and so it doesn't count as accommodation." And the judge said, "No, they may have been statutorily overcrowded, but they weren't homeless because they were living there, and you can't rely on that." So it really comes down to your personal circumstances.
So, I mean, some councils do seem to love to have their cake and eat it with those sorts of arguments where they'll kind of use it one way. I guess something else I've seen that relates into this is where I think I've even seen this. Not, I haven't worked a case like this myself, but I've seen it. I've seen it in Bedford or somewhere anyway, where basically the family had another baby, which then tipped them over that point of, they were now accepted as being homeless. And I'm pretty sure they were initially said to be intentionally homeless because they decided to have a baby. And if I memory serves me correctly, that was shown to be an incorrect approach. It wasn't for the council to
Yeah.
decide how many kids you can have.
Yeah, I remember that case happening. Everyone was sort of shocked about it. And I think it may even have been at the first instance the county court dismissed the appeal, but they definitely won in the end. And you can't treat having children as being a thing that makes you intentionally homeless. And you can't say, "Oh, you're not homeless because it's your fault. You shouldn't have had children." So yeah, that is probably the most common form of people saying they're overcrowded is just additional children.
And this potentially then it's relevant to part 6 as well because I don't know if it's every allocation scheme, but most allocation schemes I've seen there will be additional points for being 1 or 2 bedrooms overcrowded. So, one bedroom overcrowded, you are whatever, band D, and then if you're 2 bedrooms overcrowded, you get up to band C.
Yeah,
So it sounds like it also, so again, you can't make a homeless application, but you can still make a housing register application, assuming you meet their wider criteria around local connection and that sort of thing, which can be difficult with part 6. But that sounds, yes. Yeah, so I guess that there's that kind of. I'm guessing it's the same definition they're referring to there about the same calculation they're using from the
yeah. I mean, that is
1985
a fairly
Act.
universal test of overcrowding. Is part 10 of the Housing Act 85.
And so if you are in that situation where you're overcrowded and you don't, say your 2 bedrooms overcrowded, so you're very overcrowded, you don't have anyone with any particular specific needs that requires their own bedroom, so you can't make that argument. What kinds of arguments, you talked before about kids needing a place to do their homework. What other kinds of arguments might be relevant to that case or that situation?
Well, I guess you'd have to show that being overcrowded was having a detrimental effect on you in some way.
Right. Yeah.
That's you'd think that it's sort of self-evident that I'm overcrowded, that is enough, but you'd have to show that why it is. And it's a problem of living in London. I mean, most people who live in London, the closer you get to the centre, they haven't got any have you noticed there's a sort of growth in people paying for storage space in disused offices because they just haven't got any room to put things away. So people end up having to pay lots of money for that. So it's a real fact of life now, and so you really have to show some problem you're having. And I'm struggling with the one I'm doing with the mother with the toddler, with the baby in the studio flat, because it's clearly having an adverse effect on her mental health. But I mean, unless I get a sort of psychiatrist report, it's difficult to establish that.
I guess this is a bit of a tangent, but in terms of society doing something about the housing crisis, it seems that, I guess my view is that putting pressure on councils outside of London is probably a good way. Where you've got councils that aren't used to being challenged robustly because there aren't any local law firms or whatever, actually kind of challenging those councils to do better, as opposed to always focusing on London councils who just genuinely have additional pressures, which makes it very difficult to discharge their duties. It seems to me that's a more sensible, or certainly a more fruitful way of kind of us challenging the kind of the way things work. If we were to actually focus on areas, because I mean Bedford's only an hour away from London. As I say, I've never really worked on an overcrowding case myself, and I've seen a lot of cases in Bedford. So it seems to be even an hour up the M1 is it's far less pressured. And I would imagine the further north you go or the further west you go, you probably
definitely. I think it's the closer you get to central London, the more overcrowding cases you get.
Yeah,
and there was this sort of feeling. It ties in with this. It sort of came in around the time David Cameron came in, and they started talking about capping benefits and things. And there was this idea that central London was just sort of off limits for people who didn't have enough income to be able to pay the rent for places in the centre, and also places big enough. So you have to go further out in order to get affordable property of a certain size. And it's a dangerous. I mean, it's got a sort of logic to it, but it's a dangerous social precedent to set, because you get a situation where the central London becomes a sort of rich people's ghetto.
And you get the same. I mean, I probably talked to you about that book before. Family and Kinship in East London, I think it's called. It's from the 50s or 60s. Brilliant book, and it's about the effects of raising the East End and throwing people out to Harlow and Milton Keynes and Stevenage and places like that, and just the effect it had on societies where actually you completely lose that close knit community, even though the houses that were knocked down were terrible. Didn't have facilities. Actually, that had a marked impact on wider society, and I think that's something we're still feeling now with. I know this is a tangent, but kind of increase in mental health and isolation and stuff.
There's loads of sort of social issues in there, aren't there? Because if you think about it, like 100 years ago, you'd have 3 generations of the same family living in the same house, whereas now, and they might be sleeping sort of 3 to a room. Because I didn't realise that for a long time why there were so many pubs in London was because working class people used those as their living rooms, because they didn't have anywhere you could meet somebody in the house because it was so overcrowded. And now you don't get one generation. I mean, it's difficult for couples to stay together, and so you tend to get 2 units for one generation. So
it's
really difficult.
In the book I mentioned, it's really kind of cool research around, so exactly as you say, like there's a pub on every corner because. And it was kind of that thing of like, so young mothers, they would see their own natural mother every day because she lives 2 doors away, and this, their mother-in-law 4 times a week. And it's kind of really interesting just about how, and the fact that sons would go and work with their dads, and that was a career for life. And people would loan each other money, and people would know like the rent officer of the street, and there'd be kind of deals done. And you've these kind of policies, you lose all that. And I think with the Localism Act and David Cameron stuff, again, it's not correctly seen the value of actually why it's important to have kind of extended family in your vicinity, and like all these people getting put up in wherever Timbuktu sort of places is actually bad for everyone. But that's another story. But that's cool. That's helpful anyway.
I could talk about that for a while, but
we've digressed. Cool. I've got no further questions on that.